Well, one of the things I think we will want to look at, and you referred to this, is both the domestic implications of this, or in another way we can look at it as developed, stable economies with functioning governments, and the developing world. And I was curious to know if anyone would speak to some specific examples in the developing world where conflict is already occurring as a result of climate change.
Well, the obvious conflict that is on everyone's mind is Darfur, which is often pitched as an ethnic conflict, and certainly has those dimensions, but it's also an instance of a conflict over water, right? And in that sense, potentially foreshadows the other kinds of conflicts that you were talking about earlier. When it comes to the differing impacts, I appreciate your framing that way. I think that is the great story of climate change right now, that those countries most responsible for causing greenhouse gas emissions are the ones least vulnerable to the impacts, and conversely, those countries least responsible are experiencing the impacts more extremely. Important figure to keep in people's minds is, of course, this estimate from the United Nations Development Program of a need for $86 billion in new funding, not rechanneled or redistributed foreign assistance, but new funding to address the immediate impacts of climate change. Annually, going out into the future. Again, in the most vulnerable countries, the statistics that come out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that are most dramatic are the likelihood of a 50% decrease in rain-fed agriculture in Africa by 2020. That is within the strategic planning cycle of development organizations and development agencies for official institutions. If it's even remotely true, it presages a whole new cycle of famine and hunger and instability that clearly needs to be addressed. And I think a lot of the discussion that we need to have today is, what is the best way to address that? Is it by militarizing the borders and making sure that governments and neighboring countries are not destabilized by refugee flows? Or is it instead by investing in responsible and proven adaptation techniques that will lessen the impacts or enhance the capacity of affected populations themselves to respond to these impacts as they develop? I think that's very much the issue we're seeing play out.
It's interesting you divided between the stable and the unstable countries. When one of the reports that's been done on this was done by a group called CNA, which is a kind of a think tank for military affairs, and they put a report out earlier this year on the national security and the threat of climate change. And they also divided it between the stable countries and the unstable countries. And the unstable countries, they see the climate change issues as adding to the instability and creating more failed states. And when you create a failed state, that leads to the potential of extremists and terrorism and that kind of development occurring. And in the stable countries, you can imagine what would happen if in Katrina, if that had occurred at 10 or 20 years from now, when we've gone through this drought cycle, where are those folks from New Orleans going to go? Into a drought-stricken area? Where are they going to flow to? And so that's what we'll be facing in the future. Is that as a stable country, we'll have that. Plus, we have already have the problem in the United States with the immigration issue, and look at the up in arms about that. So even stable countries will be affected by that. So it really creates interesting conflicts all the way around. The other thing I thought I came to mind when you mentioned that was when the Security Council met on climate change for the first time back in April of 2007. The people who were most loud about the need to deal with this issue were these small island countries. And you think about, we've in Maryland, for example, we've already seen islands disappear because of climate change, because of rising water. And so you could see in the future whole countries disappear because of climate change. It's almost like an extinguishing of cultures. And what responsibility does a country like the United States, that's the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions, although China, I guess, ties us now, we're kind of the per capita leader. What responsibility do we have? When you're talking about future conflict, if we're taking an irresponsible approach, aren't we bringing on that conflict?
I was going to invite Elizabeth to comment on the role of international aid institutions and other financial institutions in resolving, just to focus on the developing world first.
Sure. Well, just in response to the kind of level of responsibility, a lot of times we try to talk about historic responsibility because, yes, China's at this point, if you look at yearly emissions, is on par with the U.S., but in terms of historic emissions, the U.S. is still much farther ahead. And so when you talk about kind of what sort of measures the U.S. and the European Union and some of the other industrialized countries need to take, We really see that as something that these countries need to take on, not only in terms of adaptation, which Peter mentioned was 86 billion a year, but also in terms of helping developing countries get clean energy, reduce deforestation. And the estimates on that are really high as well, 200 billion possibly from the UN in terms of clean energy needs in developing countries to help shift countries to a clean energy path that won't increase climate change. And then I think it's over 10 billion to do reduced deforestation measures, mostly on the policy level, but to try to help countries keep from cutting down the forest, which also is contributes as much as 20% to global climate change. And so, at least on the adaptation side, we've been talking about the need to we're trying to get funding for that, and we'll, obviously the U.S. government is probably going to want to put that through U.S. aid agencies, but also the importance of having as much money as possible go through a UN system and have a multilateral response to adaptation needs. In the recent negotiations in Bali, climate negotiations, they established an adaptation fund, which is governed by some of the countries that are most heavily affected. So that the fund will be administered through the Global Environment Facility, but they actually managed to change the governance structure on that so that it's not going through the World Bank's governance structure, which is very
Compromised.
well, it's
Weighted
very
towards rich
weighted
countries.
towards, right, Peter can say this too, but weighted towards the countries that are donors, but actually has reconstituted a governance structure that will allow some of the developing countries and the hardest hit countries to have a say in how that money gets spent. But one of the issues is how to get money into that fund. And so that's one of the other things that we need to look at, is where that money is coming from. And one of the things that we've been working on is trying to get that through, if we do pass a climate bill in the U.S., a cap and trade bill, that would produce money through selling off auction permits. That's one way to put money into something like an adaptation fund, or a clean energy fund, or to helping countries reduce emissions through deforestation.